This is just a short share of an activity that is probably just freshly out of the prototype stage for activity design and is sort of a more lighthearted, whimsical thing, which sometimes can be fun to bring in and appropriate. So I'm just going to run through it here very briefly. Would love comments and feedback, and however people think they want to adapt it would be great. Would love to hear people's ideas and suggestions for improvement. This is sort of like the intro for the students that we usually give to them, which is just to say, hey, this activity is the BME Eras Tour. Lots of plays on Taylor Swift, which tends to play pretty well at this point in time. Maybe we'll see how that goes in the future. But the goal is by the end of the lesson, students are supposed to be able to see a through line from antiquity to the present day, pointing towards the future of healthcare technology, and hopefully envision a role that they have to play in that future. So this is just a slide where I put my thoughts down. Really, the goal is that this is early stage. This is supposed to be for students as they're getting into a biomedical engineering field. We know from the literature that engineering identity is a critical part of getting people to stick in our majors, helping them feel like they have a place, building resiliency. So the courses where it might be able to be taught are introductions to BME, like a 101 type course. We do it at Cincinnati at what we call design and research methods, which is really an undergraduate survey course fundamentally, and really starts to introduce people to the breadth of what biomedical engineering can be. And because of that, I think building identity is hard sometimes. So it's around those strategies, literature driven things, and narrative driven storytelling and active learning. And oftentimes I do this in accompaniment with a either before or after homework activity where I ask them to go out and pick a random disease or topic that if they could cure any disease or work on solving any problem in their careers, what would it be? And find a patent, find a publication, find a professor or a researcher who works in that space. And normally that kind of accompanies this pretty well. So early stage before we dive into like surveying what BME really is. And so here's the way this works is I start class, I introduce a bunch of eras, and I say, here in these eras, we're going to go through all the way back. And we're going to go to pre-industrial revolution, agrarian society. What was life like when everybody was not quite hunter-gatherers, but in living in rural villages in your little fiefdoms or whatever. And this looks different, obviously, in a Western versus Eastern versus other different kinds of contexts, but general trends. And we are in a Western society, so I do kind of acknowledge that. And moving secondary usually goes in from the Industrial Revolution, whenever that starts into the 1930s, kind of getting through World War One, sort of invention of antiseptic techniques. Usually is kind of when medicine started to really start to take shape as a discipline. World War II, which into the 1950s, getting into more industrialized society and the things that came out of World War II, especially in the United States. I define era 4 as the space age, the 70s as era 5. I go kind of decade by decade at this point. 80s for era 6, 90s for era 7, 2000s for era 8, and then I kind of say broadly 2010s to the present day. And this is a categorically I've got 9 eras. You can divide this pie up however you want to based on the size of your course and how big your groups need to be. And so then what I do is I'm going to see if a Word document will come over into the share screen. I give them this. They have this through our e-learning platform. And I say, okay, I've introduced your eras. I'm dividing you into groups. Take this worksheet. You have 20 minutes with your group to do a worksheet and fill this out. And so they have to, and then they all, okay, one of you take the background, one of you take medical practices and technologies, one of you take a biomedical engineering impact, all from the given era that they're assigned to. And they have 20 minutes to try to fill this out as much as they can. And then I have them just like drop it into a chat GPT or Copilot or whatever. And I say, here's a prompt, copy paste this in with your worksheet, convert the attached document into a monologue that covers the history. Goal is it takes like 2 minutes for them to share this. But then this is like a giant think, pair, share. And then at the end, they all come up and we just go through and they actually deliver the history of biomedical engineering throughout. And then if they miss anything, I think is really important, I'll kind of chime in as we go. I think we're probably getting, Christine, I'm having trouble keeping track of time, but uh, I'll just kind of like run through the big takeaways that I think are important and sort of the trends that I think are good to highlight. In the first era, we talked about the fact that this was when enlightenment was really start to bring about. This was the beginning of scientific method. Major technologies were not just medical technologies, but um, medically, things like prosthetics, wooden limbs, trepanation, drilling holes in your head. Early surgical instruments like scalpels were used for the first time. Medicine was mystical. Herbal medicine was common. Healers and priests. Think a plague doctor with the big bird masks. Um, but healing was not something that was scientific, right? And that was something where, of course, you wouldn't have biomedical engineering in that context because it was the domain of other types of people in society. Moving into the industrial revolution is where engineers started to really take on more of a role with this. Industrialization starts to lead. You get physics really start bring forth new technologies and reveal parts about the way the world works, and things started becoming less mystical. Things in the 1800s, things like stethoscopes and X-rays, glass manufacturing processes became much more reliable. Introduction of reliable electricity systems, steam power, and radio all came about sort of in this second era. Medicine began to be more scientific. Hospitals became more common, but were often feared because of the rate of disease contamination. Medicine was still practiced in a somewhat distributed system with doctors making house calls. Diseases related to sanitation were the major challenges. In the third era, as you moved into World War II in the 1950s, is when things started to really develop into an industrial complex around medicine. Technological advancements started to be rewarded for how they could save people's lives, oftentimes driven by the war in World War II itself. Things like antibiotics, which happened in the 1940s and dramatically reduced rates of wound deaths. Development of nuclear technology, famously in World War II, computing systems with imitation game of fame with the Turing machines. All these things really had a root in World War II driven innovations, which is an interesting thing to realize. Um, Trust in medicine grew, and that's really where I think people started to develop a realization that medicine as an industrial complex technology could have a really big impact on the care that they received. And companies really started to come out of that with professional associations, not just in medicine, but in technology. Dialysis machines, early heart lung machines, prosthetics all kind of came out of this. In the space age, I'm going to start to move through these quicker. Space age, you started to get this industrial complex really start to produce diagnostic equipment, and pacemakers and ultrasound famously came out in very first work in tissue engineering in the 1960s. Oftentimes, people started to become more optimistic about how technology could save lives, but we transitioned more towards chronic conditions as opposed to acute conditions that were being solved. This really came to a head in the 1970s as you had things like MRI get invented, artificial joints, insulin pumps show up, but also, typo there, for increased focus on cancer. You had more of these chronic conditions really start to show up. People started to gain BMI, you started to have longer lifespans, you started to see the effects of chronic excess in medicine. But the technology was trying to tackle those problems. Diagnostics really became advanced. In the 80s, things like artificial heart, medical imaging technologies started to become mainstream. You started to see like CT, MRI systems start to show up in hospitals. It's also a time where infectious disease and AIDS was a big topic of the day. Um, Surgeries started to have a lot of more technologies involved in surgical technique at this time. In the 90s, you started to move towards minimally invasive surgeries. Um, People really started to believe in the technology of medicine and look for medical interventions based on the technologies that were being offered. Introduction of genetic techniques, which continued into the early 2000s. CRISPR started to be advanced. You got additive manufacturing show up for the first time. Um, You started to get the ideas of personalized medicine show up, and genetic engineering. You started to push the frontiers, I think, from the macro sort of towards the micro more so in terms of where the frontiers of medical technology are moving. Digital revolution also started to really appear, and data systems and bioinformatics started to drive a lot of technologies at this point. And then in the modern day, I think needs less time to talk about. It's where we're at right now. Things like the COVID epidemic driving technologies towards synthetic immuno vaccines, mRNA systems, wearables, AI in healthcare are all things that are really hot button topics at this point. We've got growing trust in a lot of systems, but also we've got some pushback that's happening against those establishments at this point. We're starting to see antibiotic resistance, ongoing challenges of cancers, and really sort of like stubborn problems are continuing to be a challenge. But we're seeing computational systems really start to pick up the slack and drive our frontiers in the microdomain forward, especially through things like um, the AlphaFold technologies and the things that are helping us elucidate different proteomic uh, therapies. So it's an interesting time. And then I challenge students to think about what the future can look like. Where do we go from here? Ask them things. What are the issues you think you'll solve in your careers? What are the technologies that you think will be breakthroughs? Challenge them to get creative, and actually can, depending on the time, have them like journal or reflect on that. What are the diseases that are the biggest issues? Once we solve our current diseases, I try to help them understand like we've sequentially actually been able to significantly affect the survival rates and outcomes for a lot of different diseases, and help them think what's next. Yeah, I try to build optimism, and um, what are best and worst cases? What's the risk for us?